My peaceful creek turned into a battleground when the homeowners association decided it was unsafe for children and insisted I drain it. They had no idea what would follow when that water sought a new route. Imagine if the same folks who wrecked your favorite spot found their own backyards turning into a soggy mess. As I walked along the creek bed, water splashing against my boots, I listened to the gentle babble that had calmed me for over a decade. Birds chirped overhead, and dragonflies darted across the surface of the stream. This little waterway running through my backyard was the best part of my home in Riverstone Heights. After a long day of fixing plumbing issues for others, I would sit by this creek, letting my stress flow away. "Mr. Jackson! Hey, Mr. Jackson!" I turned to see Timmy and Sarah Thompson waving from the edge of my property. These neighborhood kids often drop by to catch frogs or watch minnows dart between the rocks. "Can we look for tadpoles today?" Timmy called out. "Sure thing," I replied, smiling at their excitement. "Just remember to put them back when you're done." I watched them as they carefully hopped from stone to stone, their parents trusting me to keep an eye on them. My creek was shallow, barely knee-deep at its highest, but it teemed with tiny creatures that captivated the local children. Little did I know that this tranquil scene was about to turn into a conflict zone. The first sign of trouble arrived in my mailbox a week later. A thick envelope with Maple Valley Homeowners Association embossed in fancy gold letters. It was odd since our neighborhood had never had an HOA before. Inside was a welcome letter explaining that our previously unregulated area had been included in the Maple Valley HOA, which governed the newer development next door. I frowned as I read through the attached documents: monthly dues, architectural review requirements, and pages of rules covering everything from grass height to holiday decorations. At the bottom was a signature line with a concerning note. Failure to return the signed agreement within 30 days meant automatic acceptance of the terms. I set the letter aside, planning to ignore it. That plan held up for exactly 3 days until Karen Westfield knocked on my door. "Good afternoon," she said, her smile tight and rehearsed. "I'm Karen Westfield, the Community Standards Director for Maple Valley HOA. I noticed you haven't returned your membership agreement." "I'm not interested in joining," I said firmly. Her smile didn't change. "I'm afraid that's not an option. Your property deed allows for an HOA to form if 75% of local homeowners agree, and we've reached that number. If you've made it this far and are enjoying the drama of these HOA stories, you're not alone. Don't miss out on the rest of the story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for even more shocking twists." "That can't be right," I replied, feeling puzzled. "I've owned this place for over 10 years. She handed me a highlighted copy of my property documents. "This provision has always been there," she explained. "Previous owners just never activated it. We're just here to help bring some consistency to the area." Reluctantly, I signed the papers, my stomach churning as I handed them back. "Wonderful," Karen said, tucking them away. "Our first neighborhood meeting is Thursday night." She turned her gaze toward my backyard. "We'll need to discuss that unauthorized water feature." "Water feature?" I asked, baffled. "It's a natural creek that was here before my house was built." "Natural or not," she continued, "it poses safety concerns. The Thompson children could wander in and get hurt." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The Thompsons actually bring their kids here to play in the creek. They love it. "Well, Mr. Jackson," she said, her tone matter-of-fact, "unattended water features are against HOA regulations. We'll address this at the meeting." So Thursday evening found me sitting in a folding chair at the community center, surrounded by neighbors who looked just as confused about this sudden HOA takeover. Karen stood at the front with a man she introduced as Richard Westfield, the HOA president, who, not surprisingly, was her husband. "We're excited to welcome Riverstone Heights residents to the Maple Valley family," Richard announced. "Your homes will benefit from our proven property value protection strategies." I glanced around. Some neighbors nodded appreciatively, while others seemed just as skeptical as I felt. The meeting went on, covering topics like mailbox standards and approved fence heights. Just as I thought they had forgotten about my creek, Karen clicked to the next slide in her presentation. A photo of my backyard filled the screen. "Moving on to safety concerns," she said. This unauthorized water feature on Elm Street poses an immediate drowning risk to children. I stood up. That's my property, and that's a natural creek that's been here for decades. It's not something I installed. The bylaws clearly state all water features must be approved and properly fenced, Karen replied, not addressing my point. It's literally 4 inches deep, I countered, feeling exasperated. Mrs. Thompson raised her hand. My children play in that creek all the time. It's perfectly safe, she chimed in. Karen's gaze remained steady, ready to push forward with her concerns. I asked Mrs. Thompson if she had liability insurance in case of any accidents on Mr. Jackson's property. The room fell silent. Richard smoothly reminded us that the rules are there to protect everyone. He went on to say that the creek needs to be either properly fenced with a locking gate or filled in within 30 days after the meeting. After that, I approached the Westfields. It didn't seem right to put a fence around a natural waterway. Wildlife needs access to it. But what about the wildlife? I asked. Karen chimed in, expressing concern about raccoons and possums. They can carry diseases, she pointed out, suggesting the creek is drawing them into our neighborhood. Your neighborhood? I replied, a bit taken aback. I've been here much longer than you have. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder and said calmly, We're just following the bylaws that everyone agreed to. An inspection team will be here tomorrow, and I suggest you comply. The fines can add up quickly. I shrugged his hand away and walked off, feeling that something was off. Later at home, I pulled out my property survey and studied it closely. I saw that the creek entered my property from the northeast corner, flowing in from the direction of the nearby newer development where the Westfields had their large house. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstream along the creek, moving into the wooded area between developments. Eventually, I found myself at a small retention pond behind the new homes. Sweeping my light across the water, I noticed something metallic reflecting back. Carefully moving closer, I discovered a drainage pipe, mostly hidden by cattails, which led directly into my creek. I took a few photos and decided to follow the pipe back towards the houses. It led straight to the newest section of development, right where the Westfields and other HOA board members lived. While I was piecing everything together, I heard a golf cart approaching. Quickly ducking behind a tree, I watched as Richard Westfield drove up to the pond's edge. He got out, looked around cautiously, and then dumped something from a container into the water before driving away. I crept forward, shining my light on the surface of the pond, and was horrified to see dead fish floating there, belly up where he had poured whatever it was. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Ayin Wong. Check your email. The HOA just sent a violation notice. $500 fine for an unapproved water feature. They want us to drain the creek in 30 days or face a $100 daily penalty. I looked at the message, then back at the pond. This wasn't just about rules or safety. Something much bigger was going on, and my little creek had somehow become central to it all. The next morning, the inspection team showed up at 7:30. Karen Westfield was leading 2 men I recognized from the meeting as fellow board members. I watched from my kitchen window as they crossed my lawn without so much as asking for permission. Good morning, I called out as I stepped on my porch. Can I help you? Official HOA inspection, Karen announced, hardly glancing my way. She was already snapping pictures of my creek, pointing it out to her companions. I followed them around my property, growing frustrated as they walked right over my vegetable garden for a better view of the water. That's my tomato plants you're standing on, I said. You'll need to move. This garden will need to be relocated anyway, Karen replied, still not looking up. Vegetable gardens must be in backyards, out of sight from the street. It is in my backyard and visible from the side street, I countered, gesturing toward the road that lined the far edge of my property. This is Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the bylaws. For 45 minutes, they took photos, made measurements, and noted everything about my creek. Each time Karen found something to criticize, her enthusiasm grew. She pointed out the wildlife, the plants, and even suggested potential mosquito breeding. Those are native plants that naturally grow along waterways, I argued. And moving water doesn't breed mosquitoes. Standing water does. Karen offered a thin smile. Are you an environmental scientist, Mr. Jackson? No, I'm a plumber who understands water systems. Well, I'm sure the board will consider your expertise, she said with a hint of sarcasm. Once they left, I called the only lawyer I knew, Marta Rodriguez, who had assisted with my mother's will last year. After hearing my situation, she said, HOAs have considerable power. Your agreement gives them authority to oversee aesthetic and safety issues. But it's a natural creek. It's been here longer than any of the houses. Doesn't matter in HOA law, she replied with a sigh. They can regulate anything visible on your property. You can fight it, but honestly, it could take years and cost you thousands in legal fees. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived, a $500 fine for having an unapproved water feature, and orders to drain the creek within 30 days or face additional daily penalties of $100. That evening, Mrs. Thompson knocked on my door, her children hovering behind her. We heard about the creek, she said, her tone apologetic. The kids are heartbroken. Timmy turned to me, his eyes red and watery. Can't you save the frogs, Mr. Jack? I wanted to help, but I had made a promise without knowing how I could keep it. After they left, I laid out neighborhood maps on my kitchen table. Something about the Westfield's push to eliminate the creek didn't quite sit right with me. I found an old geological survey online and compared it with the current property maps. The creek didn't start on my property. It originated from an underground spring near the neighborhood's highest point, which had been replaced with new homes, including the Westfield's oversized house. The next day I went to the county records office, hoping to uncover more about the water management plan for the development. While scanning through property documents, someone tapped me on the shoulder. Fighting the creek battle? Asked Elaine Wong, my neighbor from 2 streets over. Her friendly face brought some much-needed warmth to the situation. How did you know? I asked. We've all been there, she replied, her expression turning serious. They made me remove my koi pond last month. It had been there for 15 years. My grandmother cried for days. It reminded her of home. I felt a wave of sympathy, realizing I wasn't alone in dealing with the HOA's overreach. Elaine glanced at the maps spread out on the table. Did you know this whole area used to be wetlands? She said. The developer filled it in to build those new houses. I raised my eyebrows in surprise. Especially the Westfield section? Exactly, and I think they're diverting groundwater through my creek. I found a drainage pipe leading from their retention pond. Elaine's expression turned serious. You should talk to Dr. Martinez at the community college. He fought against the development 5 years ago and warned it would cause drainage issues, but nobody listened. That afternoon, I tracked down Dr. Martinez in his small office, surrounded by piles of environmental impact reports. Of course, I remember that development, he said, adjusting his glasses. Terrible plan. They built on a natural spring system without proper mitigation. He pulled out a topographical map. See these blue lines? Those are underground water channels that run right under those new houses and drain into your creek. I nodded. That's what I thought. Exactly, he said, returning his focus to me. Your creek acts as a relief valve for groundwater pressure. If you block it, he gestured dramatically. The water has to go somewhere. It was a straightforward yet powerful reminder. Physics always wins. Understanding that water seeks the path of least resistance, I attended the next HOA meeting with this knowledge in mind. When it was time for resident comments, I stepped up to the microphone. I'd like to talk about the environmental impact of removing my creek, I began. I referenced geological surveys, explaining that the creek is part of a crucial watershed system that helps prevent flooding. But Karen, one of the board members, interrupted me. The association has already consulted experts on this, she said. Which experts? I asked, feeling a sense of urgency. I've spoken to Dr. Martinez from the Environmental Science Department, and he has concerns about this decision. We're not here to debate settled issues, Richard interjected abruptly. The violation stands. Next speaker, please, he concluded, cutting off my point. As I left the microphone, I noticed several neighbors watching me thoughtfully. After the meeting, Mrs. Thompson and 3 other homeowners approached me in the parking lot. We believe you, Mrs. Thompson said quietly. Karen has been using safety concerns to control everyone. Just last month, She made the Patels remove their decades-old oak tree because acorns were a choking hazard. "I'm fighting this," I told them, "but I need help." That night, heavy rain fell as I sat in my car across from my property, watching the crew hired by the HOA. Under portable floodlights, men in yellow raincoats dug trenches and laid large pipes to divert my creek underground. By morning, the bed of my creek was empty. What was once a flowing stream was now bare rocks and mud. I felt a deep emptiness as I walked along the dry creek bed, rescuing stranded minnows and moving them to a bucket of water. The Thompson children joined me, their faces serious, as they attempted to save what little life they could. "Where will the water go now?" Timmy asked, glancing toward the Westfields neighborhood on the hill. "That's what I'm wondering too," I replied, concerned. 3 days later, as the storm raged on, I was jolted awake at 2 a.m. by frantic knocking on my door. It was Elaine, soaked and wide-eyed. "You need to see this," she gasped. "Bring your camera." I followed her through the downpour to a newer section of the development. Rounding the corner onto Maple Drive, I was taken aback. Water was bubbling up through storm drains, flooding the street to ankle depth. Several homeowners stood outside with flashlights, attempting to redirect the water away from their foundations. And in the midst of it all was Richard, clad in a matching monogrammed raincoat, shouting on the phone while Karen directed neighbors on what to do. As I looked around, I noticed sandbags set up around several properties, and it seemed the sewer systems were struggling too. Lane mentioned that 3 houses were already dealing with flooded basements. I recalled Dr. Martinez's words about how water follows the easiest path. With my creek gone, the groundwater had found a new route right beneath the homes of those who had altered its natural course. From beneath a large oak tree, I took photos and videos to document everything. As dawn broke, I spotted something even more intriguing. The ground around several foundations appeared to be shifting, with small streams forming between houses as the soil became increasingly saturated. The Westfield's grand house stood atop the highest point and seemed safe for the moment. But as we know, physics has its own rules, and water, much like truth, always seeks to rise to the surface. They were unaware of the forces they had set in motion, but soon they would learn. The words from the HOA notice echoed in my mind. "You have 30 days to comply." Standing in the rain, I watched my cherished creek, lightning illuminating the water that had flowed here long before any homes were built. That night, sleep eluded me, so I grabbed my laptop and started researching. What rights did I have? What exactly was this creek? My simple questions led me to a depth of information I hadn't anticipated. By dawn, my kitchen table was strewn with printouts, watershed maps, property surveys, and county records. My eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, but my discovery ignited a spark in me. This creek was more than just a stream. It was part of the Riverstone Heights watershed system, a vital drainage point for the entire neighborhood. When my neighbor Sam stopped by with coffee, I excitedly pointed to an old map from 1962. "Look at this," I said. "See how the water naturally flows from an underground spring up by the hilltop where Karen and Richard built their homes?" Sam adjusted his glasses. "So, if they block your creek, the water has to go somewhere." I nodded. "Exactly. It doesn't just vanish." To get a clearer picture, I sought expert advice. I called Dr. Martinez, an environmental science professor known for her gray-streaked hair and muddy boots. She agreed to visit that afternoon. As she walked along my property, testing soil samples and taking measurements, rain dripped from her hat. Crouching beside the creek, she said, "This is a textbook example of a natural drainage system," as she collected a water sample in a jar. "These tiny organisms are good indicators of healthy water flow." Disrupting the natural flow of this creek could lead to serious problems for the entire area. She pointed toward the higher ground, where the upscale houses were located. It's important to remember that this neighborhood was built on land that used to be wetlands. Although developers installed drainage systems, these systems rely on natural waterways, like this creek, to work effectively. With this information in hand, I decided to speak at the next HOA meeting. When I approached the microphone, I noticed Karen's face twist in annoyance. I began by sharing insights from environmental experts, and as I spoke, slides of watershed maps appeared behind me. "This creek isn't just pretty, it has an important function. It helps prevent flooding by channeling water safely away from our homes. Before I could finish, Karen interrupted me. The association has already consulted qualified experts on this matter, she asserted, tapping her manicured nails on the table. I couldn't hold back my curiosity. Which experts exactly? I've reached out to every environmental consultant in the county, and none of them have spoken to the HOA. A low murmur spread through the room. Richard Westfield cleared his throat loudly, trying to regain control. That's confidential information. Next agenda item, please. After the meeting, I headed to my car, and I heard someone call my name. It was Margaret, an older woman who lived near the entrance of our community. She leaned in, glanced around nervously, and said, "What you mentioned in there was correct. They're making a terrible mistake." She handed me a weathered business card. "Call my old colleague at the water department. Tell him Maggie sent you." Just 3 days later, I met Tom Richards from the county water department for coffee. He brought along historical flood maps that supported my concerns. "Does your HOA president live here?" he asked, circling an area on the map. This whole section was classified as a seasonal wetland until 2015, when the zoning was changed for some reason. "How could that happen?" I wondered. Tom shrugged. "Money talks, but changing paperwork doesn't change geology. Water follows gravity, not HOA bylaws." Later that evening, I received an email from the HOA stating that the deadline to relocate the creek had been pushed up. They planned to send in contractors the very next day. The following morning, my stomach tightened as I watched the workers arrive. Heavy machinery invaded my backyard, while Karen stood beside her SUV, arms crossed, looking triumphant. By sunset, my once beautiful creek was gone, diverted into underground pipes. What was left was a barren creek bed that looked like an open wound across my property. That night, a massive storm hit. I sat on my back porch, listening to the rain pound against the roof around midnight. My phone buzzed with notifications from the neighborhood chat group. "Anyone else's basement flooding?" one message read. Another mentioned water coming through walls on Maple Drive, and there was also someone reporting sewage backing up in their downstairs bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled on my raincoat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. Water filled the streets, but I noticed something unusual. The flooding seemed to be concentrated around certain homes, particularly those near Karen and Richard's properties. Following a hunch, I made my way through ankle-deep water toward their street. What I found made me stop in my tracks. Water gushed up through their carefully maintained lawns, resembling natural springs. The ground around several homes was shifting, muddy water flowing up from beneath the concrete. Just then, my phone rang. It was Elaine Wong. "My basement is completely flooded, and I'm not the only one," she said. I glanced at Richard, who was frantically trying to redirect water away from his garage with a broom. "I can see it from here." "What's causing this?" she asked. I felt a mix of worry and a strange sense of validation as I replied, "The creek water had to go somewhere, Elaine. It's following the path of least resistance, right under the homes of those who disrupted its natural course." As lightning flashed overhead, I noticed something even more concerning. A hairline crack was appearing along the side of Karen's house, growing wider as the water continued to push up from below. The creek hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a new path. Soon, it would teach the Homeowners Association a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. But even I couldn't have anticipated what would happen next. As dawn broke, sirens wailed through the neighborhood. Emergency vehicles lined Karen and Richard's street, and crews began pumping water from flooded basements. I stood with concerned neighbors, watching the unfolding chaos. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7, Richard shouted through a megaphone, his designer shoes squelching in the mud. Just hours before, his perfect lawn had transformed into a soggy mess. By mid-morning, news vans arrived, and a reporter pointed a microphone at me. "Sir, you live downstream from the affected homes. Has your property experienced any flooding?" Strangely, I replied, "No, it hasn't." I paused, then added, "My property used to have a natural creek that helped manage water flow, but the HOA made me remove it just last week." The reporter's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The creek was removed?" Just before the flooding started, Karen appeared out of nowhere, stepping right between us. While it may have seemed like a coincidence, the truth was that this situation was a clear failure of our city's infrastructure. She quickly pulled the reporter aside to show her the emergency pumps. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a text from Ani asking if I had seen the damage to the Thompsons' house, which he described as the worst on the block. I hadn't seen it yet, but I headed over to their property. When I arrived, I found Sarah Thompson sitting on her front steps. She was surrounded by soaked photo albums and family heirlooms while her husband Dean was hauling waterlogged items to the curb. This was the same family whose children Karen had used to justify her targeting of my creek. I felt genuine sympathy as I approached her. "I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it. They weren't my enemies. With red-rimmed eyes, Sarah looked up and said, "Our insurance agent just left. They won't cover anything because it's classified as surface water intrusion. The adjuster mentioned we're in an unmapped flood zone." I helped them lift furniture to a higher place, while she shared how water had surged up through their basement floor, ruining everything, including her grandmother's handmade quilts and their children's baby memorabilia. That evening, the community center was filled with angry voices. Every seat was occupied, and neighbors who had never spoken up at meetings before were demanding answers. Karen had to bang her gavel repeatedly to maintain order. "This meeting will come to order. Our first agenda item is the unprecedented flooding event," she announced. Richard stepped forward and adjusted his tie as he spoke. "The board has been in contact with city officials. It appears we are facing a failure of city infrastructure. Rest assured, we are demanding immediate action." Questions erupted from the audience. "Who will pay for the damage?" one man shouted from the front row. "My basement has flooded 3 times this week." "Your homeowner's insurance," Karen began, but was interrupted by someone else saying, "They denied my claim because this is what used to be wetlands." I patiently raised my hand until Karen finally acknowledged me. "I've been researching our neighborhood's geological history," I said, connecting my laptop to the projector. "What we're experiencing isn't unprecedented at all." My presentation displayed historical maps of the area, dating back to 1962, long before any development. Our entire neighborhood was built on a natural floodplain. The developers had installed drainage systems, which included natural waterways like the creek on my property. I moved to the next slide, showing a county survey map that outlined the water flow patterns. Just last week, the HOA ordered me to remove my creek, a decision that eliminated a vital drainage point. Karen's face flushed. She seemed incredulous. "Are you suggesting we caused this disaster?" I responded calmly. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating hydrological facts. Water always follows the path of least resistance. In this case, that path is right under the foundations of homes built on filled wetlands." Richard stood up suddenly. "Are you admitting responsibility for this damage?" "I didn't redirect the creek," I said, looking directly at him. "The HOA did that, against my warnings and expert advice." The room buzzed with discontent. Parents whose children were allegedly at risk because of my creek now faced thousands of dollars in water damage. Homeowners who had previously stayed silent during HOA meetings began demanding answers. Margaret, a retired employee from the water department, spoke up. "I've contacted my former colleagues at the county. They're sending engineers tomorrow to assess the situation." "They don't need HOA permission," Margaret continued, maintaining her calm demeanor. "This is now classified as a potential public health emergency." As the meeting descended into chaos, I began to gather my materials. Sarah Thompson approached me, her voice low. "The water in our basement keeps coming back, no matter how many times we pump it out. Our foundation is cracking. The HOA is telling us to handle it ourselves, but we can't afford these repairs." "How many other families are in the same situation?" I asked. "At least 12 on our street alone," she replied. "We need your help. You seem to understand what's happening better than anyone." I hesitated. Getting involved could make me a bigger target for Karen and Richard's anger. "I'll help, but under one condition," I said finally. "When the time comes, we vote for new HOA leadership." Sarah nodded firmly. "Just tell us what to do." The county engineers arrived the next morning, taking soil samples and conducting ground surveys. I walked with them, showing where my creek used to be and how water was now pooling in unexpected places. This is exactly what we warned the developers about 15 years ago, the lead engineer said, shaking his head. You can't just fill in wetlands and expect water to cooperate. Their official report arrived 3 days later. The recent flooding in our neighborhood has raised serious concerns among homeowners. A report indicated that the issues were directly linked to changes made to the natural drainage systems, particularly the removal of a creek at 247 Meadowlark Lane. When I discovered that my address was mentioned in the report, I had trouble sleeping that night. The next morning, I stepped outside to find all 4 tires on my car slashed. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a note that read, "Back off or else." Instead of scaring me, this threat only strengthened my determination. I took photos of the damage, called the police, and got in touch with a local newspaper. The reporter who had previously interviewed me was eager to cover my story again. The headline, "HOA blamed for neighborhood flooding," grabbed a lot of attention. 2 days later, the article explained how our homeowners association, HOA, had ignored expert advice and forced the removal of a natural drainage feature, resulting in property damage for several homeowners. My phone began to buzz with calls from neighbors I had never spoken to before. They shared their own experiences with the HOA, revealing tales of arbitrary fines and selective enforcement. One neighbor told me how they were forced to take down their son's basketball hoop because it was just 2 inches taller than the regulations, while another pointed out that Richard had parked his boat in his driveway for months without consequence. What started as a personal struggle over my creek quickly grew into a larger issue. It seemed the HOA had unintentionally rallied a community that was fed up with their overreach. That evening, while helping the Thompsons set up water barriers around their foundation, I noticed Karen and Richard watching us from their car. When I caught their gaze, they drove off quickly. Shortly after, our neighborhood group chat buzzed with a message from Elaine. "Emergency meeting at my house tomorrow at 7 p.m. Do not discuss this here. Spread the word personally." I could feel a change brewing in our community. When Officer Jenkins arrived to assess the damage to my car, I mentioned the slashed tires and handed him the threatening note in a plastic bag. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, focused on his task. I replied, "The HOA president and his wife aren't happy with me right now." Just then, my phone buzzed again. It was Elaine again. "Emergency meeting at my house right now." When I arrived, I found people packed into her living room, the atmosphere thick with worry and frustration. One neighbor shared that their child's bedroom ceiling had caved in the night before. Sarah Thompson shared a tough story with us, showing pictures of her soaked stuffed animals and ruined books. Her voice trembled as she explained that her belongings are now with her parents. Then Michael Rodriguez stood up, hands shaking. He spoke about 3 feet of water in his basement, where his daughter's quinceañera dress, a treasured piece from his grandmother in Mexico, was stored. Now it was gone. Taylor Williams chimed in, clutching a letter. She mentioned that insurance companies were labeling their homes as high-risk flood zones. Suddenly, the room filled with stories of lost family photos, mold creeping through walls, and cars trapped in mud. Karen kept asserting it was a city problem. In contrast, Elaine revealed that the city engineer had privately admitted the issue stemmed from a creek diversion. As I listened, I cleared my throat and laid out some old property maps on Elaine's coffee table. These maps illustrated the natural water paths before any development took place. "Does this look familiar to anyone?" I asked. People leaned in, and it became clear the flooding pattern matched perfectly with the original waterways. I explained that the Homeowners Association, HOA, had broken at least 6 environmental regulations. I had been in touch with a reporter from the Tribune who was interested in our situation. "We've tried to be civil," Elaine commented, "but what has that achieved?" I directed their attention to specific locations on the map. These 7 drainage points used to allow water to flow freely. However, when they constructed over them, they installed drainage pipes not built to handle this volume of water. "What if we just fixed them?" suggested Michael. There, a plan began to take shape. We decided to create a group chat called the Weekend Gardening Club to keep things under the radar. On Saturday morning, about 20 of us gathered with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, pretending to work on a community garden plot. We split into teams, and my group went to the drainage point behind the community center. As we dug through the packed soil, we uncovered the original stream. Sarah called out, triumphantly holding up a piece of plastic. They literally covered the natural drain with construction debris. We worked tirelessly under the hot sun, with sweat soaking our shirts. Old Mr. Jenkins brought us lemonade, and kids joined in, creating a game out of carrying small rocks. Just as we were finishing up, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the common area. Karen jumped out, her face contorted with anger. "This is vandalism. I'm calling the police," she yelled. I approached her calmly, covered in mud but smiling. "Hello, Karen. We're just ensuring proper drainage as stated in Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws." I handed her a laminated copy. It clearly stated that homeowners may perform maintenance on drainage systems to preserve property values. The commotion was intense as neighbors gathered, drawn together by a sense of urgency. Families, even those who weren't directly affected, came to witness the event unfolding. "Is it really destruction to prevent our homes from flooding?" Taylor asked, stepping forward. "Or is it destruction to ignore what the environmental experts have warned us about and redirect a natural creek?" I noticed Karen's husband, Richard, pulling her aside for a quiet discussion. He looked troubled as he pointed toward the growing crowd. As evening set in, dark clouds rolled in, and the forecast predicted heavy rain for the night. We picked up our pace, working diligently to finish 3 important drainage channels. "Do you think this will work?" Elaine asked as we packed up our tools. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and I surveyed our progress. "There's only one way to find out," I replied. That night, rain hammered against my windows, making it hard to sleep as I pondered the effectiveness of our efforts. At dawn, I slipped into my boots and raincoat and walked through the neighborhood. Where there had once been street flooding, water now flowed smoothly through the newly created channels. I followed the main path all the way to the end, which led to Westfield's backyard. What had been a site for Karen's garden parties was now a pristine pond, with water flowing gently just as the original wetland had. At the edge of this new pond stood Karen, staring in disbelief at her reflection in the water. Nearby, a local news crew was capturing the moment, with cameras flashing as the reporter announced, "Homeowners claim HOA negligence has contributed to neighborhood flooding." Behind her, the neighbors pointed out the damage to their homes. Karen pushed through the crowd, her designer shoes sinking in the mud. "Turn those cameras off. This is private property," she insisted. The reporter replied, "Actually, we're on the community easement, as noted in the county records. Would you like to comment on claims that your HOA ignored environmental warnings before redirecting a waterway?" Just then, Richard reappeared, pulling Karen back into the crowd. "No comment. We'll be issuing a statement through our attorney." The story aired that evening, and by morning, my phone was buzzing with messages from neighbors I had never really talked to before. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight," read the official email. "Attendance is mandatory. Failure to attend will result in automatic approval of all measures." The community center parking lot was overflowing with concerned residents. Inside, every seat was filled as we anticipated a heated discussion. Homeowners filled the room, papers in their hands and frowns on their faces. At the front table, Richard and Karen sat alongside the other board members, their expressions tense with pressure. Richard tapped his gavel 3 times, signaling the start of the meeting. "We'll be discussing unauthorized landscape changes that have affected the neighborhood's appearance and property values." But from the back of the room, a voice interrupted. "That's not why we're here," said Michael Rodriguez, raising his phone. "I've been on the line with FEMA all day. They're considering labeling our flood damage as a disaster caused by human actions." Whispers spread among the crowd. Taylor Williams added, "I've heard from my insurance company that they're looking into a class action lawsuit against the HOA for creating dangerous conditions knowingly." Karen's cheeks flushed bright red. "These claims are unfounded. We followed all the right procedures," she insisted. Next, Elaine stood up, holding a thick folder. "I have copies of the environmental impact study submitted before the creek diversion," she began, distributing pages to those nearby. It clearly warned about potential flooding if we altered the natural watershed. And here are emails that show the board received and ignored these warnings. Richard banged his gavel down again. Those documents weren't meant for public distribution, he said, frustration creeping into his tone. But they weren't meant to be kept secret either, someone responded from the crowd. Public records laws allow anyone to request that information. I took a step forward, addressing everyone. I also have the original permits. They show that the Westfield homes were built on protected wetlands without proper authorization. A wave of voices erupted from the room. Parents whose children were traumatized by rising waters, elderly residents who lost treasured belongings, and families displaced while their homes underwent repairs, all raised their questions, creating a tumult. Sarah Thompson pushed her way forward, her voice piercing through the chaos. My children can't sleep at night because they're scared water will come through the ceiling again. Who's going to pay for their therapy? Richard struggled to regain control, his words lost amidst the noise. I caught a glimpse of worry exchanged between him and Karen. Finally, Taylor Williams climbed onto a chair and whistled sharply, silencing the crowd. "We've prepared a petition," she announced, holding up a stack of papers. "It calls for immediate board elections and has already been signed by over 3/4 of the homeowners. According to the HOA bylaws, that's enough to force a vote tonight." Karen seized the microphone, her frustration clear. "This is ridiculous," she said, aiming to reclaim the meeting's direction. "We've kept property values steady and upheld our community standards. Without our efforts, this neighborhood might struggle." An elderly man, who I had never seen speak at a meeting before, stood up. He said, "My wife and I have lived here for 30 years. We've watched as they filled in the wetlands to build those upscale houses. Nature always finds a way in the end. You can't fight water, it moves where it wants." The vote wasn't even close. Elaine became president, while Michael and Taylor joined the board. Their first decision was to approve a comprehensive water management plan, which included restoring my creek. A few months later, I sat beside that creek and watched tadpoles dart between the rocks. The water sparkled in the sunlight, reflecting off the banks where native plants had returned. Neighborhood kids built a small bridge downstream to watch for frogs under their parents' watchful eyes. The Westfields had sold their house at a loss and moved away. The new owners embraced the wetland restoration project, even adding bird feeders to attract more wildlife. "It looks like it was always meant to be here," Elaine said as she joined me by the creek. I agreed, dipping my fingers into the cool water. "How's the class action lawsuit going?" I asked. "Settlement talks start next week. The HOA's insurance is covering most of the damages." Just then, a blue heron landed gracefully at the water's edge, studying its reflection before it struck at a small fish. "You know," Elaine said quietly, "Karen left something behind when she moved." I asked what it was. "A sign that said, 'Danger, water hazard, keep children away.'" Elaine smiled as she continued. "I put it up by the community garden with a new sign underneath. 'Nature is not a danger, but a teacher.'" I laughed, watching the water flow freely where it was always meant to go. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from courts or rules. It can simply come from allowing nature to take its course. What might our world look like if we stopped fighting against it and began working with it instead?